Popular music is a broad and nebulous term, but across centuries and cultural traditions, much of it has been instrumental. Western classical music alone spans multiple centuries, and although this canon features a lot of vocal repertoire, alongside this is a healthy amount of instrumental music. Chamber music in particular focuses heavily on instrumental repertoire, with configurations like string quartets, piano quintets and wind quintets enjoying enduring popularity to this day, along with concertos which emphasize instrumental soloists. This can also be said for 20th century popular music like ragtime and jazz. Other musical traditions feature a great deal of instrumental music too. Bulgarian folk dances and Indian rags are frequently instrumental, although they often also feature voice. But when we look at the charts, it's actually very difficult to find any instrumental pieces. It is very heavily dominated by songs which foreground voice, very often the voice of a single performer.
I could be a star now.
My aim in this video is to explore the reasons for this and to gauge whether instrumental music has declined in popularity or whether its purposes have simply evolved. Let's have a quick look at the function of instrumental music across cultures and time periods. The most obvious function seems to be to facilitate dance. In her article, Dance in Anthropological Perspective, Adrienne Kapler describes dance as a visual manifestation of social relations, and in their article, The Role of Human Body Movements in Mate Selection, Nadine Hugel, Bernard Fink and Nick Neve make comparisons between human dance and courtship behaviour in animals, including close relatives like chimpanzees and more distant animals like birds and spiders. As such, instrumental music often appears to play an accompanimental role in social communication and even sexual selection, and this can be seen across eras and cultures. Baroque composers like Bach and Telemann would write minuets and sarabands and other dances which were expressly intended for social occasions, and folk music and dance can be seen to play a key role in social gatherings across cultures, such as English Morris dancing, various Balkan folk dances, and numerous African dances, just to name a few broad examples, each of which have regional variants. But not all instrumental music is necessarily intended as dance music. Some composers might draw upon old forms which were originally intended as dances, but which no longer have a place in mainstream society as a dance. For example, a composer is now more likely to write a minuet as an exercise in Baroque composition. It would be unexpected to hear music like that in an environment like a club or at a wedding. Some styles aren't necessarily intended as dances at all. For example, new complexity composers like Brian Ferneyhough might explore how a performer responds to a near overabundance of detail, or experimental composers might explore the limits of an audience's perception. For example, my friend George Gomez writes polyrhythms that happen over such a large timescale they can't be consolidated by the listener or performer as a single perceptible event. Why might someone write music like this?
Myriad factors I can't just think off the top of my head.
One reason I find quite interesting is a view espoused by Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapffe. In his 1933 essay, The Last Messiah, Zapffe posited that the human capacity for introspection is a harmful effect of evolution which results in existential terror, and he observes four main methods by which we might surmount this despair. Two of these methods might be considered especially relevant. By intently listening to music, we're engaging in distraction, limiting our focus to one particular experience in order to escape angst. By writing or playing music, we're engaging in sublimation, refocusing the restless energy of existential anxiety towards a creative task. So if instrumental music clearly has such a multitude of uses, why then does it seem to be unpopular when compared with how ubiquitous music for voice is in the domain of contemporary popular music? First, let's see if people have a preference for certain frequencies, and let's see if this preference is situated around the range of the human voice. In an article entitled The Evolution of Voice Perception, Katarzyna Pisański and Gregory Bryant address perceptual adaptations for processing voices of the same species. They note that there are specific areas of the human brain, such as the middle superior temporal sulcus, that are specialized for human voice perception, and that like how we learn to process and recognize faces, these regions develop within 7 months of birth, with perceptual biases towards speech over similar non-speech sounds appearing as early as an infant's first day of life. So we can see that people might be naturally drawn to the sound of the human voice. There are reasons that this would be evolutionarily advantageous, but could this affect music perception or even music preference? In the same article, Pisanski and Bryant describe vocal signaling, for example, a cry, and the co-evolution of behaviours of both the signal's sender and its receiver. In the case of a cry, the evolved behaviours benefit both the sender and receiver. The sender receives care and attention, and the receiver puts an end to that damned noise, and in ancestral environments prevents the crier from signalling their position to potential predators. So from this, it seems like you could start to make the case that not only are you hardwired to focus on the sound of the human voice, but that you have also evolved to respond to it as a signal. Perhaps this is why emotive vocalizations in music are cathartic for the performer and stimulating for the listener. Maybe singing in its various forms is basically a signal which benefits both the sender and receiver. Perhaps there is something exciting about singing. From the perspective of the listener, they are receiving what could be argued to be a simulated signal of danger or distress, and maybe this arousal of their senses could be a factor in their preference for vocal music if they have one. But let's further unpack what it might mean to be drawn to the sound of the human voice. This can't simply mean the range, because it's difficult to define the range. What we hear is complex, the way we hear is complex, and the way we perceive and respond to what we hear is complex.
Obviously don't have the talent.
Every sound has a fundamental frequency, the lowest frequency created by the sound source. As the voice is a complex sound source affected by the resonance of acoustic chambers in the larynx, throat, mouth and nose, it emits additional higher frequencies which relate to the fundamental in what is called the harmonic series. Without going into too much detail, all of the characteristics of a sound, pitch, timbre, intensity, are the result of a complex interaction between the fundamental frequency and its harmonics, in addition to factors such as amplitude. Basically, what this means is that when you hear a voice, you aren't just hearing its fundamental frequency, so it would be inaccurate to try and identify a general range the same way you would work out the range of a singer. When writing for a singer, you're only interested in telling them what to sing, whereas here, we want to clarify how we perceive the details of what we hear. For example, the bandwidth in use in telephony, according to Liu, Fu and Narayanan in 2009, is 300 to 3400 Hz, whereas a study by Ronald J. Bacon suggests the average speaking range for an adult male would be between 85 to 155 Hz. This means that in some situations, on some telephony systems, we might not even hear the fundamental frequency, just the harmonics, which we would then use to predict the fundamental frequency, meaning that whilst we wouldn't hear the fundamental frequency, our ears would be tricked into thinking that we were. This also means that we wouldn't hear information above 3400 Hz, which would be useful for recognizing some consonants. This is why the NATO phonetic alphabet is necessary. These details matter, and the way that we perceive them and use them to deduce the characteristics of the sound matters. If my friend Saxton sings a C4, and I play the same note on my bass, you can differentiate between them, even though they both share the same fundamental frequency. Remember that Pisanski and Bryant suggested we can differentiate between human vocalizations and similar non-human sounds. Taking this at face value, it could be expected that you might pay special attention to Saxton as opposed to my bass, and that's because his voice possesses acoustical properties which distinguish it as a human voice, and we are able to instantly recognize that. It's difficult to say definitively, but perhaps this could be a factor in a person's preference for vocal music. Even if so, the way we process voice at a perceptual level isn't the only possible influence on musical preference. There are also potential cultural factors too. The first of these I'm going to look at is sexual selection. One thing I haven't discussed is the presentation of music, which varies between genres and cultures. I'm going to focus on pop music, which is a largely visual medium. Live performances for the most popular acts often feature choreography and elaborate light displays, and even as a recorded medium, music is very often accompanied by film. Whatever way it is presented, pop music often focuses on an individual, showcasing not only their musical performance, but also their physical performance. We now know that we pay particular attention to the sound of a human voice, and we generally expect the voice to have prominence in pop music, Coupled with the visual focus of pop music, it might be interesting to think about how sexual selection might play a role in music preference. A sexual dimorphism is a difference in characteristics between a species' sexes which goes beyond the difference in sexual organs. One example is the drastic differences in voice characteristics between male and female humans. When it comes to this difference, in the article Sexual Selection on Human Voices, David Putz, Leslie Dahl, and Alexander Hill observe that these traits affect attractiveness and perceptions of dominance and predict mate preferences and behaviour related to competition for mates. They argue that voice plays a role in sexual selection for both males and females. Laboratory studies suggest that males prefer feminine voices, especially for short-term, purely sexual relationships, and when the woman's voice indicates positive social interest. These traits are often present in the styles of popular female singers, deliberate registral breaks that hint at fragility, or ornamental runs which allude to a feminine suppleness and agility. Males are subject to a similar scrutiny from females, and arguably more so, since traits are more likely to be shaped by sexual selection in the sex which invests less in offspring, i.e. males. According to multiple correlational studies, women seem to generally prefer vocal traits like lower pitch or masculine timbre, and one reason for this is that these traits signal heritable fitness benefits like heritable dominance and social status. So for both sexes, it is possible that their preference for vocal music is fueled not only by their predisposition to pay attention to the human voice, but also their preference for voice type could be influenced by what appeals to them in terms of their sexual selectiveness. There are a lot of problems with that idea though. First of all, heterosexual people often like to listen to members of the same sex sing, so sexual selection almost certainly isn't the only thing affecting their preference, if it affects their preference at all. But another important point is that a lot of popular singers don't necessarily possess the vocal traits that would be generally considered desirable. For example, singers like Bruno Mars or Justin Bieber are popular, often among females as well as males, and they don't have particularly masculine voices in the sense that is described in the articles we looked at. For the purpose of this discussion, let's assume that sexual selection does play an indirect role in music preference. Why might you enjoy listening to someone you don't find particularly attractive despite this? One answer could be vicarious fantasy fulfillment. On some intuitive level, people do often seem to understand the role of status, fitness, dominance, and other such traits in sexual selection, and as such they may be driven by a wish to be desirable. As such, the portrayal of what could, on the terms of the pop narrative, be considered a hero might be appealing as a form of escapism, or distraction as Peter Wessel-Zapffer might have it. The idea that pop music is a form of fantasy fulfillment and escapism is nothing new. In his book, Understanding Popular Music Culture, Roy Shuker explores this idea at length, noting parallels between celebrity culture in music and the Hollywood film star system. Shuker asserts that stars are invested with a cultural value and are popular because they resonate with particular lifestyles and cultures, while also representing a form of escapism from everyday life and the mundane, and that stardom in popular music is as much about illusion and appeal to the fantasies of the audience as it is about talent and creativity. Shuker goes on to describe stars as mythic constructs which enable their audience to construct meaning out of everyday life. If we relate this back to Zapffer's 4 remedies against panic, we could argue that an audience's indulgence in the musical product is a method of distraction, and their derivation of meaning from the individual celebrity and their surrounding culture is a method of anchoring. Interestingly, Shuker also points out the economic function of a celebrity. He describes them as a unique commodity form, which he views as both a labour process and a product. For example, Bob Marley was a performer, that was his job and he laboured, but he himself was also a product in addition to his music being one. Even beyond his personal fame drawing the crowd to his concerts, he was also iconised to represent entire subcultures. On this point, it is arguable that an audience's enthusiasm extends beyond the individual, and that they see the individual as a representative of something greater. Of course, this can also be true for instrumentalists, but the most visible figureheads do seem to be singers in some capacity. Maybe more people can relate to having the immediate facilities to sing, and that this is an influential factor in the popularity of singers. So why is vocal music more popular than instrumental music? Well, it might not be. I've actually failed to demonstrate that it is. There are a few ways you could qualify popularity. If popularity meant quantity, then given all of the television and film incidental music, and given all the advert jingles, then it's possible that more instrumental music exists than vocal music and therefore is more popular. But if you took a survey of people's favourite music, and more people answered with vocal-centric styles and artists than not, then you could maybe argue that vocal music's more popular. Really, since it's likely that you either are a person who prefers vocal music or have at least met someone that does, I thought it would just be interesting to explore different reasons that might drive this preference. It's worth noting that despite the ubiquity of vocal music in popular culture, there are people who vastly prefer instrumental music, myself being one of them. I wonder why that is. I can't be bothered researching it now though, so might do it another time. The topic I've covered is very broad and even vague, so think of this video as a kind of discussion piece rather than some kind of academic meta-analysis. I'm not an expert in any of the subjects I've covered, which is important to note. You could write multiple books on multiple facets of all the various disciplines I've skimmed over in this video. But hopefully this should provide plenty of material for a wider discussion, so leave your ideas in the comments. Also, go to Bandcamp and buy my crap.